Hi, Hi everyone. Do you hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. Thank you for coming here tonight. We are a small neighborhood bookstore, and so we're delighted to have a Pan America event here. Like a lot of other bookstores, we do a lot of things. We have events here, like the ones tonight. Tomorrow we have a panel of women who are all debut authors. They're all publishing their first novel, and so they're going to talk about the road to publishing. We also have writing workshops. We have book clubs, and if you're interested in any of our events, we have cards over there that you can fill out, and we will put you on our email list. We also do something here that a lot of bookstores don't do, and that is that we print books. We sell books and we print books. We have, if you may have seen, there's a big machine upstairs, and it's called the Espresso Book Machine. And that machine can print a quality paperback in less than 5 minutes. That's why it's called the Espresso Book Machine. We have about 7 million titles on our catalog for that machine. Every book that has been published before 1923 and is in the public domain can be printed there, and we sell them for $5.99. And then a lot of publishers are putting their backlist on our catalog, and that means that eventually, when enough bookstores have that, there's not going to be such a thing as an out-of-print book. We had an event a few days ago, and one of the authors had a book that was printed in 1997, and luckily for us, it was in our catalog, and I could print it for the event. Otherwise, we would not have been able to have it. And then we also work with schools and with colleges and print anthologies of the work of the children or of the students. And then, of course, we have people who choose to publish directly to retail. It used to be called self-publishing. We don't like that term because we think that it's a way for some authors to control the whole process and to publish exactly the amount of books that they want. So we can print one book, we can print 500 books, and we can also put them in our window on our shelves. So it's called print on demand. So among the events, as I said, we have this wonderful event tonight, and I'm going to introduce you to the participants. The moderator tonight is going to be Bryony Cole, over there. Bryony has talked to more than 100 experts and everyday people about the future of sex. Through stories with technologists, scientists, filmmakers, and therapists, she has documented the largely unexplored area of technology's impact on sexuality. She's the host and creator of Future of Sex podcast, a co-author of the Future of Sex 2016 report, and in 2017 she will launch New York's first sex tech hackathon, promoting innovation in women's empowerment and health. Her mission is to shift models of sexual health and education globally through media innovation. Devineni is also a tech whiz. He produced The Russian Woodpecker, which won the Grand Jury Prize at the Sundance Film Festival and was nominated for an Independent Spirit Award. He's the creator of the interactive social activist comic books Priya's Shakti and Priya's Mirror, which received the Tribeca Film Institute New Media Fund from the Ford Foundation and supported by the World Bank. And I hope he's going to show you the amazing technology associated. This is not just your everyday comic book. And he's also been honored by UN Women as a gender equality champion. Andrea Pino is a co-author of We Believe You, Survivors of Campus Sexual Assault Speak Out. She's a co-founder of the National Survivor Advocacy Organization and Rape on Campus. Her work and personal journey is prominently featured in the film The Hunting Ground, which premiered at the 2015 Sundance Film Festival, and she appeared alongside Lady Gaga and 50 other survivors at the 2016 Academy Awards. Jessica Luther is an independent writer and investigative journalist living in Austin, Texas. Her work on sports and culture has appeared in the Texas Observer, Austin Chronicle, Sports Illustrated, Vice, and The Guardian. Jessica's work gained national attention in August 2015 when she and Don Salomon broke open a story about a Baylor football player on trial for sexual assault, a case that hadn't been reported on for nearly 2 years. She's the author of Unsportsmanlike Conduct. Please give them a warm welcome.
First of all, thank you, Francoise, for having us. This is such a critical topic to be talking about any day, particularly in 2017 as well. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. I'd like to start over the other side with Ram. Ram and I met in Australia a month ago at a technology festival, us both being tech heads, and realised we're both working as well in the field of sexuality. Now, I don't know if you want to demo first the book. So you don't have the phone.
No, I do have my phone.
Okay.
I do have my phone, and actually I'll be giving out free comics to everyone here, so I can show the demo.
Great.
Yeah, right.
Afterwards. Is that mic working?
Is it working? Let's just put up the volume a little. Is this better? Okay, cool.
Okay, so let's get out of the way and talk tech, because I'm super interested in sex tech, and how that's changing attitudes around sexuality. Now, for you, you're using augmented reality in cartoons. It's I've never seen it before. It's very engaging. Do you think that this is able to broker new conversations, and how is that technology being used across different cultures where technology uptake is different in India as it is to US or Australia?
Sure. I mean, I guess the innovative part of the comic book is the use of the AR. And what's kind of, just to give you a background on what AR is, you can literally scan any page of this comic book, and popping out of the pages, you'll see animations, videos, interactivity, including my interviews with rape survivors in India. I think the real kind of importance of the technology is being able to add this new element or this additional element, and especially giving the voices in their own voices of the women that helped create the comic book. I mean, the biggest problem, especially with rape and surrounding in India, is a lot of the rape survivors, even if they want to speak out, are prohibited from going out and publicly talking about it, because there's all these laws set in India to protect them, but it also kind of hinders their advocacy. So using the technology, especially AR, allowed us to embed their stories with animation and cartoons and things like that to help tell their story in their own voices. And you can scan the last page, and you can actually hear the stories in their own voices of the women that helped develop this comic book. One of the really critical things we're doing with this project, the comic book is India's first female superhero who's a rape survivor, and was created after the December 2012 gang rape that happened on a bus in Delhi, where I was involved in the protests in Delhi, and that's where this idea all came from, to really challenge the patriarchal views that surround rape, especially in India, and to create, there was what I just quickly discovered, and I was completely new and unaware to the problems that women faced when it came to gender violence. And what I quickly discovered is that a lot of the rape survivors that I interviewed had enormous trouble getting justice, because the blame was always put on them, and they faced the stigma surrounding rape, and we're going to talk a lot about this. And the idea of the comic book, and especially the use of the technology, is to sort of challenge those views and to create an environment, especially amongst teenagers and teenage boys, to feel comfortable, to understand the problems that rape survivors face and women face with gender violence. That's the reason why we do it in a comic book format, and we create like a superhero structure for it. So that's kind of a big answer for that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm curious what the reception has been from teenagers, guys and girls, to the book?
Sure. Well, we have over 26 million readers worldwide. There's been over 500,000 digital downloads, and we've handed out almost 20,000 printed copies of the comic book in India through the Comic Cons. And this spring we're going to be in schools in Delhi. And this all started December 2014, when we launched the first chapter. And the second chapter, Priya's Mirror, was about acid attacks, and it also involves me interviewing many acid attack survivors and incorporating their stories into the comic book format. So it's been a huge hit, over 500 news stories. I think the real power of the comic book is that these are very difficult topics: rape, acid attacks, gender violence, and it's by putting it in a comic book format and telling it in like a superhero structure. A lot of people have found it very approachable to talk about this and to really understand gender violence, especially amongst teenagers. You know, I know. I mean, I'm a documentary filmmaker, as my bio says, and I know if I wanted to make a documentary, especially about the December 2012 gang rape or gender violence in India, a lot of teenagers just wouldn't watch it. It's just there's no culture of watching documentaries or news stories about this topic in India. But comic books are like hugely popular, and then of course adding on to the use of technology has really, especially with teenagers, have totally kind of blown them away. When I show the AR, and I'll show it to everyone here afterwards, when I show the AR at the comic Comic Cons, they're just like, it's like eye candy. They've never seen anything like it before. And it's just another added incentive for teenagers to go in deep into this comic, and especially to hear the voices of the women.
Yeah. One more question with the augmented reality, because this is just such a advanced technology, not many people are using it. Is that a barrier at all? Do you see that, or is that kind of like the nice addition?
Well, we launched it 2 years. I guess a lot of people have heard of Pokemon Go, right? So, if you played it, or your younger sister played with it, I don't know, or younger brother. Well, we launched AR in India 2 years before Pokemon Go came out. So we were way ahead of the curve. And when we launched it, and especially when you think about it, you think Pokemon Go is kind of like the logical thing for AR, but a comic book about rape using AR, it's like mind-boggling. And when we launched it, it got enormous amount of attention. Just the technology itself, back in January 2014-15. And Fast Company just did a huge article talking about how we're revolutionizing augmented reality in India, and especially using it as a way to talk about acid attacks. We had over 40,000 uses of the AR, and this is 2 years before Pokemon Go came out. And that is mind-boggling when you think that AR never existed really in India. So 40,000 uses is quite a lot. Yeah, worldwide, but 40,000 uses is quite extraordinary number.
Amazing. Thank you. Jessica, we're going to move to home territory now in the US, and looking at college age reports of sexual assault. Now, you've written a playbook that shows how people respond to public reports of sexual violence, specifically in colleges and around football. College age is, you're kind of hitting your 20s, at least in Australia. I think it's like late 19, 20 years old. I'm wondering if that is too late to be teaching kids about consent. And when I look, to the Netherlands, they teach consent at around 4 years old. So my question for you is, what is the right age to be teaching kids about consent and these values? Yeah.
Is this on? Oh, right up on my mouth. Okay. Here we are. Hi, y'all. On some level, it's weird that I wrote a book about college football and that we talk about this primarily around college age. There was just a big AP report about the amount of sexual violence that happens not only in high school, but middle school and even elementary school within this country. The idea that we are starting at 18, which is when the average age for going to college in the U.S., I do think at this point in time we're in such a crisis of so we have failed miserably to teach consent within this country, and there's a way to mandate it when they go to college, right? And that's part of what's going on. So it's good, and I think that that's good that that's happening. But yeah, I mean, my joke is always like, if I ruled the world, it would be awesome. But also, we would teach it starting in kindergarten, like consent. And I think one of the things that's a problem with how we talk about it is we almost exclusively talk about it with sex. And so that makes people very nervous to introduce ideas about consent when we're talking about 5-year-olds, right? But consent is so much bigger than just in sex, right? And it's all about setting up boundaries and teaching people what yours are and respecting other people's and having that kind of communication. And that is something that you can work with a young child on. I have an 8-year-old son. Poor guy. He's gonna and we've been doing consent with him like as early as we could, including, you know, the sort of cliche version of this now is like, if he didn't want to hug anyone else, like if someone wanted a hug and he didn't want to do that, then we wouldn't make him do that, right? Which was actually really hard for adults. They would get upset about it because of the perceived power dynamic between them and my child, which meant that I had to negotiate those moments. Like, well, do you want a fist bump or high five? You know, like to appease the adult in the situation. And you know, now he's 8 and there's all these like playground dynamics that are going on. And so much of the conversation of him interacting with other 8-year-olds is really about boundary setting so this idea, it would be wonderful if this was like part of the curriculum starting at a much younger age, so that by the time that they're having these conversations, when they're actually having sex, when they're going to college and they're having these new experiences, they already have a built-in language and a way to talk about these things and an understanding that it's not, I mean, some of these places that I end up writing about, and a Title IX coordinator said this to me. Title IX is the law in the federal statute that says you can't discriminate at an educational institution in this country. If you receive federal funding, you can't discriminate based on gender. And under this, if someone has experienced any kind of gendered violence, from sexual harassment all the way up to rape, in that entire spectrum, the university has to do something about it. Because if they're not, then that person's not going to have the same access to education as all their peers, right? And so therefore, it's a violation of Title IX. And over the last 6 years, lots of schools they have to have a Title IX coordinator who sort of oversees all of this. And a Title IX coordinator pointed out to me at one point that she had students who the very first time that an adult ever said anything to them about sex was when they got to campus, and it was her job to say, don't rape people. And she's like, what kind of context do they even have in that moment when they're not even having conversations generally around this stuff? So it's like, you know, and then we're trying to teach them consent, and they don't have that education, and just sort of how messy that all is.
That breaks my heart to hear that. I was just thinking about that when you were talking about your son too, and just that whole culture around appeasing and not ruffling any feathers. And I think that's something, especially as women, I know I've grown up with, you know, never make any waves. And that bleeds into, when it comes to those incidences of sexual assault, reporting and whether or not to report. And I'm curious, in your explorations, what constitutes good college reporting of sexual assault? If you want to answer this too, Andrea.
Yeah, I'm going to say Andrea might do a better job at this. It's really hard to say. Like, we're sort of in a moment where we're watching universities and colleges like really struggle to get this right. And I mean, I'm a reporter. Most of the time that people contact me, it's to tell me about bad stuff that has happened to them and institutional failure. One university that I worked at, or that I worked on, and there's a 100% appeal rate. So the first time that they go through the Title IX process, whatever the outcome is, 100% appeal rate at this. Like, no one is satisfied with whatever's happened, and it, even when the person who's reported the violence, even when they quote unquote win, they'll appeal because they didn't like the process or they don't like the outcome, or also like So most of what I come in contact with are people who are unhappy with how this has gone, and there's this weird tension that Title IX coordinators and people who do that work on university campuses have to deal with. So there's a federal law, if I say this wrong, please stop me. There's a federal law that mandates, called the Clery Act, that mandates that universities have to say how many acts of specific kinds of violent crime have happened on campus every year, right? And they're really bad at this. And so you actually get universities who will go 6, 7, 8 years saying 0 sexual assaults have been reported on campus, which is statistically impossible. And so then you get these people who come in and like their goal is to make a campus environment, a community environment where people who've experienced this kind of violence feel comfortable enough to come forward and report it, right? And if you do that, the thing that's going to happen are numbers are going to go up. And PR marketing people don't want, like, you're literally going to go from 0 for 8 years to like 30. Like, what does that look like on a chart? Mm-hmm. Like, how does a nervous parent interpret that information? And so you get this sort of tension of like, no, it's good. If numbers go up, that means people feel more comfortable reporting. But then what does that look like, right? And it's actually really hard to find like good examples of how all this works on the ground as far as reporting goes. The University of Texas, which I live in Austin, they have a bunch of researchers who look at this exact issue, and they just published this huge report about sexual violence in the UT system. So I don't know how many schools there are, 13 or 14 in the state of Texas within the system. And they found, I think it was just about Austin, which is the flagship that has about 50,000 undergrad students. They found that 6% of people who said that they had experienced sexual assault reported to the university, someone at the university. 2% had reported it to law enforcement. Like staggering numbers, but like that's how not comfortable people are with reporting, and they have good reasons.
Andrea, I'm curious your answer to this question too. Are there good examples out there?
I think looking for the perfect school, I think it's really the wrong question to say, is there a school that's doing this perfectly? Because I think there are schools that are doing certain things well. I mean, to give the example of UT Austin, they have a really great gender violence center that's also kind of interwoven with the LGBT center as well. They do a lot of really good programming all year round, which I think is very unique. I mean, that was one of the schools I've been to that I think had the most programming around this issue at all different angles, whether they're Native American students or Latino students or undocumented students. They had a program for survivors in that category, which I think is very unique, and I think it speaks of the population at UT. But I do think that schools really across the board are struggling with this issue. I think this idea that 0 sexual assaults is a good thing is something that we as the public need to move away from. And I do think it's not just an American problem, it's an Australian problem, it's a UK problem, it's a Canada problem. Annie and I have traveled to different countries and we've seen the same problem. And I do think it's because the way the media talk about sexual violence, it makes us think that it's something that we can prevent, and that if we keep our students from the bad schools, it won't happen to them. So I do think that this issue really isn't going to get better until parents start demanding more transparency from their institutions.
Do you think, I read that you sort of cover the silenced voices, but in areas that maybe surprise some people, maybe you could talk about that of different populations that experience sexual violence but never talk about it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with who we see as the perfect victim. I think the media has this idea of the victim as being blonde, fair-skinned, from a good family, who was preferably a virgin and didn't do anything wrong to put herself in that situation. And I think that, especially as young women, I was taught that I should do certain things to prevent violence from being done to myself. And I think the same thing can be said of people in all other different types of populations. I think in particular folks who identify as queer or trans are already trying to navigate life in survival mode. I think especially under this current administration, there are so many different types of oppression they're trying to navigate. So the idea of coming forward if something happens to you, I mean, you're preconditioned to not trust the police, to not trust institutions. So why would you come forward if something happened to you? So just like Jessica was saying, I think that we need more data on this issue. I mean, I'm glad that the UT system has done their own surveys, because as of right now, we haven't seen a lot of federal guidance looking at kind of large-scale survey data. So I think a lot of people are in denial of this issue because we don't know its scope yet. And when it comes to minority populations on campuses, I mean, you're talking about people who are already struggling to be students. I think especially at predominantly white institutions, large institutions, Ivy institutions that are already, have reports of being hostile towards minority students. I think we just started the conversation over, do our students even feel do they feel safe even coming forward to begin with?
Exactly.
Even if it's not sexual violence, even if it's harassment or just feeling unsafe, do they feel safe coming forward with just that, right? Because I think it's impossible for us to know how often this happens until we create a culture in which it's worth coming forward.
And just some thoughts on how you do that. I know I'm asking for the keys to the castle here, but like, how do you create this culture of sensitivity? How do you approach survivors with sensitivity?
I think talking about this issue is the first step. I think that, we live in a world in which we don't think sexual violence happens. And what we say in our book, and then Annie's my co-editor, she's over there, and Barbara are wonderful editors there as well. I do think that, we need to really approach these issues and approach these stories with care and compassion, because there is a lot of fear to coming forward. I mean, why would you come forward if you see what happens to survivors who are dragged in the media? Why would you come forward if you've seen these people with power and privilege who even then are not believed? So I think we, as what we call in our book everyday activists, need to start talking about this issue, because until we start moving sexual violence out of the ivory tower, out of survivor support groups, out of safe spaces where we can tell each other our stories, people won't know that it happens. And I think especially people that are not survivors, or even if they are not in direct threat of the perpetrators or have some type of privilege, I think it's really our duty to talk about this issue, so that it no longer just becomes, a checklist on universities' to-do list, but it really becomes a priority for all universities.
Gotcha. And this is a question for everyone. I'm curious, do you think technology can help amplify that conversation and be used in a positive way to talk about this stuff? And also, obviously, the negative effects of sexual harassment in the physical world often continue online through slut shaming and harassment. So what are your thoughts on either using technology for good?
I actually have a question for you also. The big thing now, which has become a bit scary, is Facebook Live. And especially...
Are we Facebook Live in here?
No, that's for archival purposes, I think, for pen. That's being used as a tool to broadcast rape and especially shaming and other things. I mean, when you spoke to technologists and social activists, what did you learn from sort of how technology can be used to hopefully counter that, or did you experience anything?
It's basically the Wild West. So with these sorts of things like live streaming or approving advertising or Facebook groups like the recent one with the military, the Marines sharing, non-consensual photos of their ex-girlfriends and their ex-wives, there's humans behind the technology that are moderating this or looking through the Facebook requests, but really, and we saw the murder of someone I hope you didn't see it, multiple people.
Stuff we don't even know about.
Yeah. And so, there's no regulation in place really to govern it. And so what I found is people are testing it, they're experimenting with new things, but there's no one that's really coming in as like the lawmakers to stop this.
So I have 2 points.
Sure.
I think it's important to know that technology has revolutionized activism. I mean, our book literally came together because a whole bunch of cool activists met on the internet. I mean, most of us hadn't even met in real life until our book launched. And I was like, oh, cool, look, this is my friend who I met like 3 years ago on the internet. And I do think that things have been able to happen that wouldn't have happened 10, 15 years ago because we now have this accessible, equitable platform to share information. And I think also, when you think about just the movement for campus sexual violence, we learned about these laws and these resources because we taught each other. one or two of us had taken a course and we shared what we learned from the ivory tower with people who didn't have that privilege. So I think that in a sense it has broken those boundaries, that it has given people access to knowledge that they wouldn't have otherwise had they not gone to an Ivy League university. At the same time, I do think that it does open the floodgates to essentially 24-hour bullying for especially women identified, queer identified advocates and activists who are working on this issue nonstop. And I think to say that the First Amendment gives all of us freedom of speech, I think demonstrates an ignorance that some of us don't have that freedom all the time. I mean, I think Jessica and I talked about this. I mean, we are constantly afraid of speaking our mind because we don't know if that person with a gun might be in the audience. But that's really a fear that we have to deal with, especially when we get rape threats or death threats on Twitter and Facebook. I mean, these things happen. And I think that there's more that these companies can be doing. And I think that the reason why maybe it hasn't become a priority is because they need to be hiring more women in these departments. They need to actually have people who understand these issues working for them. And we know that there's a whole bunch of people who are working behind the scenes of Facebook Live. I mean, they just announced that they're hiring, I think, another 4,000 people to tackle these online videos. I mean, these are people whose jobs I don't envy, who watch beheading videos and suicide videos and rape videos all the time, videos that we don't even get to see. But I do think that some of them are still flowing through the cracks because there aren't more people working on this. And I would also say that it's important for us as kind of everyday people to be conscious of the effects of these videos. I mean, I saw a lot of people sharing that murder video that should not have been sharing that video. And I think that, even though we are, kind of desensitized to violence in this country, especially, I think it's so important for us to, whether it's reporting these videos or encouraging people to not share these violent videos. I mean, there's a way for us to tackle this problem. And I think it's also important for us to talk about the effects of these videos, even if we are not, direct victims of it. I mean, there are people whose lives are really hurt by what they see, whether they're triggered or, there's also mock suicides or mock murders that come with these high profile videos. It's really important for us to talk about those effects as well.
I'm going to just piggyback off of a lot of what you said. One thing that I know, like you see it with like a Twitter hashtag when one of these things happen, and you get these like community of survivors that happens organically. And that can be really powerful. Like one of the issues around the stigma of sexual violence is that a lot of survivors internalize and they imagine they are the only one. They're the only one that this has happened to, and they make a lot of excuses for why this has happened to them, and they victim blame, they blame themselves for what's happened. And through social media, you get people sharing stories and seeing commonalities with other survivors and recognizing that, in fact, this is not just them, right? I profiled a survivor, and she was assaulted multiple times in like a week-long period, and she froze every time. And her going out and telling her story, like one of the things is that survivors contact her to be like, I froze too, and I thought that there was something wrong with me, like that meant that I wanted it to happen. I didn't fight, like what was wrong with me there. And just hearing this one other survivor's story, right? But then you think about this, like when you see it in social media in real time, it can just be gigantic. At the same time, when I get ready to publish a survivor's story, one of the things, we've already had many discussions about going public, but the last step is, like, I talk them through cybersecurity. Like, I want them to get ready for all the things that could happen by going public, and sort of how they need to protect themselves from the people who spend a lot of time tearing survivors down because they have access to their stories and access to them in a way that they didn't have before because of how media now works. And so it's like the other side of that coin, right? They're going to go out, tell their story. They're going to provide. They're going to show that this is actually something that happens to other survivors too, and they're going to start that process. At the same time, they're taking on so much that can be so dangerous for them. And so, like, prepping them for what this will look like on the other side. Because you just literally never know what it's going to be like.
Before we jump to audience questions, I wanted to just ask you if there's a story or someone that you interviewed that is most impactful that you want to share about.
Okay. You go. You interviewed for her today.
I gotta think about it. I wasn't ready. Man. I don't know, that's so hard for me because I can pull up so many survivor stories in my head. Like, one of the things I didn't understand about this job, and I feel like you probably speak to this better than I, as soon as you go out in public on a national stage at all and you say anything that shows that you see victims and you care about them, as they will start contacting you all the time, which is really a result of the fact that they are just looking for someone who will say, I'm sorry this happened to you and I believe you. Like, we believe you, right? The title of their book. And so they see me as good. It's good. They see me as a safe person. They can tell that too. So I hear a lot from survivors. I just talked about the woman I interviewed that froze. And her story, it was really hard for me because the frame on that one was about she has severe PTSD, and being in public and being a public survivor triggers the PTSD, and she does this sort of cycle over and over again. I don't know, I'm trying to think now.
That's okay.
I mean, like, honestly, so many of the stories are the same.
Yeah. What's the commonality?
And the people that I talk to, and I think this is really important, and I try to say this, so thanks for getting me there. The trauma and the violence is very bad, and this is not to minimize that part of the experience. For so many of the people I talk to, the worst moment, though, is when they tell someone they think will care about them, and then that person does not care. And often for me, it's talking to people who are telling someone at an institution where they think, oh, well, clearly this person at this institution will care about me when I tell them this story and they will help me. And then they don't get that care and help in response. And that can be particularly devastating in a way that even, it's like the hell of that moment. Mm-hmm. Every time. And, and I think people miss that part of it. They don't necessarily get what that moment means to survivors.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Jessica said. I think it's hard to pick like one story that resounds with you. But I think working on the book, I think there are many passages I could pull apart. But I think it's seeing the book come together and seeing so many of the stories, regardless of national origin or culture or sexuality or gender, and seeing so much of the similar patterns, I think is both empowering and heartbreaking. And I think seeing people who had similar experiences with their parents and having different religions and different cultures and being like, oh wow, like they went through that too. I thought it was something I said wrong to my parents. And I think for a person who's a survivor, putting the book together was not an easy feat. I think I'm at the point now where I have read so many survivor stories and I have been contacted by so many survivors, and very much, just like I said, in all different platforms, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, my parents' address, my grandparents' address. So I don't know how they got these addresses, which is kind of strange and also a little unnerving. But, it's just like people will try to get a hold of you. And I think it's very different people who are trying to threaten you. It's people who genuinely just want to be heard, even if you will never reach out back to them. Actually, one of the people whose stories really resounded me was actually an Aboriginal girl in Australia, who was just saying how she felt that as a person who's Aboriginal in Australia, as it is, she deals with so many problems and I think she was in her early 20s and had been sexually assaulted more times than she could count. And she's like, I'm in the middle of nowhere, I'm in Australia, and this isn't really a movement here yet. And if it is, it's only in Sydney and South Australia. It hasn't really reached me yet. So I think, a person who's very different from me is from literally halfway, or more than halfway across the world, having very similar experiences. I think, she never thought I would reach back out to her. She had somehow gotten a copy of the book. I think a friend had given it to her, and she said she was really thankful that she had picked up the book because she had considered taking her life. So I think it's those stories, and that has been echoed. There was like a distant family friend who had a family member in Spain who very similarly had picked up the book and had considered taking his life. And I think it's those stories that, again, that so many people attempt to take their life or successfully do so because they're not believed. So I think knowing that there is a book out there that they can pick up and that can be kind of that resounding solidarity that they've always been wanting, I think in itself is invaluable. And I think that's exactly why we put the book together. And I think Annie and I were very thankful to work with Barbara, not just as she's in the room, but actually because she was a great editor. Because it's really hard to talk to survivors about working on a book. I mean, not all survivors are writers. Not a lot of them have shared their story publicly at all. A lot of them were anonymous because they didn't feel safe sharing their story. And it's hard to put a book together when you're putting so much of yourself out there, and especially because some survivors lash out at you. They feel unsafe that you're misquoting them, they argue, or that you don't understand them, or that their words aren't being put the right way on paper. And it's not really anything on you, it's just, hurt people. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the hard thing about being an advocate, is that you have to maintain those boundaries, because when it comes down to it, self-care is just as important.
That's exactly, sorry, what I was my next question was gonna be is, you get contacted daily by survivors. That in itself could be exhausting, it could be desensitizing, it could send you into a dark hole. How do you cope with that? How do you make sense of that?
I think it's definitely a skill to it. I think that advocates and activists, we preach self-care all the time, but we rarely practice it. And this goes for everybody. It's not you. You might think you're great at self-care, but you could always be better. And it's really because we perform all the time, especially those of us that are out at protests, or we're giving talks, or we're writing about this online. We put on this persona because it's who we are and what we care about. But then sometimes you just break down, whether it's an internet troll who makes you fear for your life, or it's your parents who don't understand what you do, or it's just, walking in your city and being like, why can't I stop thinking about this article that I read, or this story that I read that someone messaged me. And you really do have to be intentional about those boundaries. Sometimes it's taking a break from this work, sometimes it's binging a TV show on Netflix, or it's walking your dog and not thinking about it. But I think you have to be intentional about those boundaries, because if not, you can burn out. And that there have been so many books written about activist burnout, and I think especially where we are now in the political scheme, it can be really hard. And I live in DC, and there's literally a march every weekend. You don't have to go to every march, it's okay. I've been to like 4, and it's just, after every march, I'm like, all right, this is a lot. And it's okay, you're not you're not an imperfect activist for not going to every march or reading every terrible article. Sometimes it's okay to just take care of yourself.
Jessica, is it the same for you?
Yeah, you actually said, do you get desensitized? And I was like, damn, I wish I did. That maybe would be better. So I cry a lot. I'm not so good at self-care. I'm trying to figure it out. It's like a work in progress. I have a therapist. I read romance novels. A lot.
Who's your favorite author?
Courtney Milan, Alicia Ray. You should read them, they're great. But yeah, part of it is I've had to learn to not take in more stories than I have to. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of hard, right? And so I'll be asked to go on, something will happen. God, when Donald Trump said locker room talk, I was like, no, because I knew that I was going to have to talk about it now, because he had made it about sports. And I was like, damn it, man. But a new case will break, and everyone will send it to me. The world sends it to me. And I'm like, oh shit, I'm gonna have to read about this now. And if I won't at first. And then I'll get asked to go on a radio show, and I will never go and talk about a case if I haven't read enough to really talk about it. So then it's like, oh, I gotta dig in now, so that I make sure that I'm true to what has really happened in this case. But if I don't have to do that, I will just not consume it. And I've had to teach myself that's okay. It's okay to not have read everything on this. And there is, that's the other thing about social media. At least I feel this pressure, if something breaks, I need to get on Twitter and have an opinion about this. And I've had to be like, no, it's okay. I think most people understand how I will react to each and every single one of these things now, that I don't need to I don't have to be saying it for every single one. But yeah, that's a huge work in progress for me. I'm not good at the boundary setting, and I don't have yeah, I just feel like it is something, and you're not prepared for it. Like when it happens to you, when you get in it, it's not something I was ready for. So I've been doing this for 3.5, 4 years, and I'm still, I need to get better at the self-care.
When I first published the comic, when it got all the media attention, I used to get a lot of emails and Facebook Messenger from rape survivors, not only in India but also like in the UK and other places. And I'm definitely not qualified in any way to provide advice or therapy. So, we always have a conversation, and at the very end, I always try to direct them towards people that can help. The focus of the comic book is really to sort of change societal perceptions towards rape survivors and to challenge patriarchy. And just a funny note, like people have asked me numerous times, how is this comic book going to stop rape? Things like that. And I always say, if someone's going to attack you, just roll this comic book up and use it as a weapon, because it's really designed for like long-term cultural shifts, and that's sort of where like I'm trying to what I'm trying to do with this whole project, and then also just me being a man, it's very complex. I obviously spent a lot of time interviewing rape survivors and acid attack survivors, and they're all women, and they're all in India too. So having them, there's so much social dynamics, gender dynamics, especially talking to especially a man about what happened to them, and to have them tell their stories. I never force anyone to tell their stories. In fact, all the women that I've interviewed that are in the comic book and helped create the comic book are all became advocates, and they wanted their stories to be told. And in most cases, especially with rape survivors in India, they didn't have a platform to tell their stories. So this was really an ideal kind of situation for them. And so I think, that's it.
Question time. Does anyone have any questions?
Of course I do. This is for Cheska and Andrea. I really appreciated and thought the Hunting Ground film was very powerful, and it came at a really interesting time in this country in regard to campus sexual assault. For you two specifically, what do you think the effect has been so far from that film to almost a couple of years out? I know these things take a while to get a kind of real impact, but what have you seen so far, if anything, that has made you feel at least optimistic about where things are actually going?
A lot of people have seen it, so it's become sort of a cultural currency in the little space that I fill. I can actually, whenever I talk about you or Annie, I'm always like, have you seen The Hunting Ground? They're in that. And most of the time it's yes, right? And it is really powerful. Like, I've seen it now 5 or 6 times. I'm trying to... Really? I'm trying to not see it anymore, if I can help it. But yeah, there's certain parts of it that make me cry every single time. So
it's on Netflix. So you can watch it.
And yeah, it's incredibly powerful. The part about when they talk about telling their parents, that like wrecks me every time. There's many lawsuits against Baylor right now, and I read them all, and one of them actually uses the phrase, this was a hunting ground. I was like, oh, now it's making it into like lawsuits because it's familiar enough within these circles. I don't know. I don't really have. You probably have better stories about like impact on whether or not survivors have come forward and that kind of thing. I mean, I hear about a lot. There is a pretty big section on college football in there, and so I know for a lot of people who care about this issue but maybe don't understand it within sports, they find that particular part very educational in a way that they hadn't really considered before. So that makes my job easier too. So I do hear about it with that, especially because it's like the one place that, for this one really high-profile case, that the victim has spoken out publicly, and so it was a big deal for that. But I don't know. I haven't really heard a lot from individual survivors about what it means to them.
Yeah, I would say that when it got on Netflix, I think it really hit a lot more people. I mean, and since Netflix owns the rights to it right now, I mean, it's all over the world. So it was really popular in Australia, it was really popular in Canada, it was really popular in Denmark for some reason. Also Iceland. So it's just like random countries where we'll get notifications from people in languages that we don't read.
You could go to Iceland?
So we actually, Annie and I connected in Iceland, and one of the, it's a really popular, connecting hub to go to the UK anyway, whatever. So we were flying an Iceland Air. It's a great country, you should go. Anyway, so we were connecting in Iceland, and one of the workers was like, I've seen you somewhere. I was like, I really doubt it. There's like 300,000 people in this country, and I'm not one of those. And like, I've seen you before. He just like kept like everyone's waiting in line behind me, and it's like, oh, you were in that movie. Oh. Yeah, it's just like, okay, thanks. And then you just like keep going. So I definitely say the film is really popular, especially internationally. And actually, there was a big donor in Australia who started the Hunting Ground Australia project, and he donated, I think, almost $1 million to screen it at Australian universities all around the country. So it was really popular in Australia, and I do know that. But when it comes to kind of the crux of the documentary, what they wanted to do was drive home that there is institutional indifference when it comes to this issue. And I think that it is one of the only films, one of the only projects that's done that. And when we talk about media covering this issue, I do think a lot of reporters don't really understand that this issue has been happening for a very long time. I talk about her all the time, especially when you have reporters who think it's a new issue, and it's like, where have you been for 10 years? Mm-hmm. But really though, I feel like every time I talk to people, it's like, oh, I didn't realize this is such an important issue, and this has been happening for so long. And it's like, where have you been? Did you go to J school? But truthfully, I do think, I know you didn't, you're like one of those, but yeah, I mean, truthfully, I do think that reporters need to be more educated on this issue. I do know that some journalism schools are starting to talk about this. I know that my alma mater, for example, requires students to learn about campus sexual violence before they graduate. But I do think that as great as the Hunting Ground has been for getting the issue out there, I do think that reporters are more inclined to cover this issue episodically, which means they focus on singular, examples of sexual violence rather than covering it as a national problem. I think a great example and a missed opportunity was the Brock Turner case at Stanford, where everyone knows about Brock Turner, and everyone thinks that there's only one Brock Turner out there, when there is actually one in every school, in every classroom. I mean, there's so many different types of Brock Turners, so many different cases that sound just like that one, but didn't get even a fraction of the media coverage. So I do think that's a bigger example of how we as a society think about sexual violence. We think that it's something that's very preventable, that it only happens to women who put themselves in those situations. And as great as the Hunting Ground has been about exposing that that's not what it is, I think that we as a society are still very inclined to resist that reality.
So just on that, just talking about how media impacts survivors' lives, how harmful can that be?
I think especially with this election, I think it can be very harmful. So this essentially was my dream, for this to become a presidential discussion point. I mean, let's make sexual assault a relevant presidential debate question. And I do think that it went as horribly wrong as it possibly could have. It became more about what survivors do to bring this upon themselves, or how women lie. I mean, that's really what a lot of the media coverage was around this issue. I think that good journalism can radically change the way we interpret sexual violence. It's hard to say where our notions come from. I think we as a society just think that sexual violence looks a certain way, and I do think it's naive to think that reporters don't bring those preconceived notions to the newsroom. I think they do. I think in particular male reporters tend to ask these same questions, or tend to belittle sexual violence while they report. I do this for fun because this is what I do, but I like to tweet headlines back at the newspapers when they're really terrible, when they call sexual assault sex case, or they call them trysts, or they call them sexual flings, or something that's not rape or sexual assault. But believe it or not, it's actually very common that reporters call sexual violence what it's not. And I think especially in terms of campus sexual violence, since most of these cases are not criminal cases, reporters will not call them rapists, they won't call them abusers, they'll call them the accused. So essentially we make this about two people fighting rather than a crime. So I think that as it is, we have a long way to go when it comes to reforming when we talk about sexual violence, but I do think that reporters can be better with how they treat survivors, how they talk about this issue. And I think the main thing is that we need to talk about sexual violence as an epidemic and not as a singular incident situation.
Well, I could do that all day. Talk about reporting, how they get it wrong. The Women's Media Center actually did a really great. They looked at how sexual assault is reported, and one of the things they looked at the difference between men who report on it and women who do, and there's like fundamental differences. Women interview women. They talk about victims. A lot of male reporters who cover this don't ever do that, which kind of blows your mind when you think about it. I'm going to talk about the Brock Turner case very quickly. So most people know about it because the victim in that case wrote a very powerful impact statement that she read in front of the court, and then they published it on BuzzFeed. And she actually talks about the media's influence. I wrote about it because I pay attention to this and it's really the way she describes. She doesn't remember what happened to her. She wakes up in the hospital. They're like, you were probably assaulted, right? And she goes home. And then the first time she reads about what happened to her was in the media. And they describe this horrible thing these witnesses saw. They're actually witnesses in the case, which makes it weird. And then they list his swim times, like how quickly he swam. And she was like, what the hell? Do these two things have to do with each other? The media can be really harmful. And because other survivors read that too, right? And people who will one day be victims read that too. And they take in sort of what will be reported about them. And yeah, I'll yell about this sometimes on Twitter, but like one thing I've started to do is just send emails to reporters that write. Like I sent one to a Washington Post reporter before Brock Turner became like a whole thing. He wrote a really horrible piece about it. God, it was so bad. And I was like, this is literally harmful. Like survivors will read this and this will hurt them. One thing that the media does is they write about sexual violence in the passive voice, which means that nothing happened to nobody, right? No one's doing anything. And it's such a phenomenon that there have been academic studies on the impact of it, and it is exactly what you think it is, which means when you write about sexual violence in the passive voice, the reader comes away thinking that nothing has happened, which we live in a society that is so ready to discount anything survivors say. It's sort of, I mean, I'll just say it, like I think the media is cowardly most of the time. They're just cowards about this issue. They don't want to call it rape. They don't want to call it sexual assault. And they shrink and they get very nervous about it. And it is, I just can't, it is harmful. And they need to do so much better. So I don't love to do media criticism, but I do it as much as I can because I think we've got to fix it.
What, a couple more questions?
So I'm from Canada, and what really struck me is when you were talking about like how popular the movie has been internationally, and one of the things I find, having lived in the US for a while and going back to Canada, is that a lot of people in Canada think that things like racism are American problems, not Canadian problems, and it's like, no, you're wrong. But how is that? Have you seen any like cross-cultural differences in how these stories are like received, or how like do people in different countries react differently? Canada's not that different culturally, but different enough. Like
for me, I mean, I mainly read on college football, which is such an American thing, but everything mirrors itself in hockey. So I've read multiple, I mean, they're horrific college hockey cases in Canada. And I've talked to Canadian media, reporters in Canada are like, no one cares that this has happened here. And I'm like, yeah, it sounds almost exactly the same. I don't have as much, because because the sport that I'm famous for writing about is so American. I don't hear about it as much in other places, but you get like huge scandals, and there's a soccer abuse case in England it's child sexual abuse, but it is huge. There's something like 526 potential victims, right? And that's in England right now, and continues to unfold. So these kind of things certainly happen in other places with sport and other places, but I don't hear about it quite as much.
So I'll say really quick, I've been to Canada twice. So Annie and I went to Winnipeg, and we were at 3 different universities there, and then we went to UBC, and we gave a lecture at UBC. And this is definitely an ongoing conversation in Canada, and I do know that there are some pretty high-profile provincial complaints that have been filed. So the way it works in Canada, instead of filing a federal complaint, you file a provincial complaint, so you do it within your province. And it's hard to say what's going to come from that, because there isn't kind of an established complaint process. I mean, you essentially just see what the minister does, and nothing's kind of really been officially established. But there is a pretty high-profile case, Andy Gray's case at York University, that's kind of still ongoing. And I do think that when it comes to Canadians' response to sexual violence, I do think it's just equally as atrocious as Americans. I think that can be evidenced in the response to the Ghomeshi cases. Annie and I got hate from like Ghomeshi sympathizers, and we're not even Canadian. We're like, we don't even know who this guy was until like a month ago. But people just went behind him, and it was just like, oh, this guy is like Canadian excellence. Like, these women are just lying, and they're all sluts anyway. But I think that response, that's exactly the problem that we're having in the States. And I do think that kind of Canadian denial, British denial, it's the same thing. Australian denial of campus sexual violence, I think, just shows that it's easier for us to deny than it is to admit the onus. And I do think it's a problem everywhere, because sexism is a problem everywhere, violence is a problem everywhere, and to say that it's just a problem in one country, I think just shows that it's easier for us to say that it doesn't happen than it is for us to combat it.
Just briefly about India, I remember before the gang rape on the bus in December 2012, if you looked at the media, there was like no reporting about gender violence or rape at all. It was total vacuum, total silence. And then after the horrific nature of the crime, which like everyone in the world heard about, it became literally this kind of rush to sensationalism. It's like, what's the next horrific rape we can cover in the news and show? These 2 sisters hanging themselves on the tree. It just kept piling up and up and up. And always been the biggest focus in India was always been about punishment, about the perpetrators. How do you punish them? What is death sentence, whatever, and so on. And I remember, like, when the comic book came out, there was a lot of people trying to have a discussion about how society treats rape survivors and the stigma surrounding that, but it wasn't being covered. I remember when the comic came out, that really helped kind of facilitate that discussion. It was very important to kind of shift that debate from perpetrators and punishment towards societal, how the culture of rape can exist and how they can kind of perpetuate the problem. There's still a lot of coverage in India about gender violence. I think it's much muted as opposed to what it was before. And I'm actually kind of, whatever can be said about the horrific, the rape that happened on the bus, it did really put gender violence on the map and made it a big topic and focus in India.
Okay, I know you have a lot of questions, and we've already gone over, so I'm going to wrap it here because we're doing a book signing, and you can also ask questions at the same time. Just wanted to thank Ram, Jessica, and Andrea for coming and for their time and sharing their thoughts with us.
Thank you, Ram.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming here. This was a really fascinating discussion, and I wish we had a little more time for the questions. But we have a few books to sell. We have a lot of books to sell, but we have a few books, a few Sportsman-like Conduct, and We Believe You. And Ram has his free comics here. So, and we have a wonderful signing table in the back. So please stay a little longer for the signing part.